Like it or not, the senior and elderly population is vulnerable to negligence committed by medical professionals, nursing home and assisted living facilities, pharmaceutical and medical device companies, insurance companies, and everyday individuals and businesses. The Injured Senior Podcast is here to help. Steve Heisler is the creator of the National Injured Senior Law Center and has been advocating for seniors' rights for over 20 years. You have questions, and Steve Heisler has answers. This is the Injured Senior Podcast.
Well, hello, Injured Senior community. Welcome to the Injured Senior Podcast. I am Stephen Heisler, founder and CEO of the National Injured Senior Law Center, coming to you from one of the best places to be during the fall. Yes, that's right, coming to you from beautiful Baltimore, Maryland. For those of you who are new to the show, the Injured Senior Podcast is a weekly show where we discuss issues of vital importance to our injured senior and elderly community and to the children and loved ones of our injured senior and elderly community. Furthermore, we make it a top priority to educate our listeners on how to not become an injured senior or elder. I am your humble host, and I am so glad to be with you today. I want to thank the National Injured Senior Law Center for its kind sponsorship of the Injured Senior Podcast. There are 100 or so million people in the United States over the age of 50, and the National Injured Senior Law Center is the legal advocate for the aging population in America. Now, as I informed you over the past few shows, we have Dr. Joe Casciani on the podcast today. Dr. Casciani is a clinical geropsychologist. So our injured senior community is faced with physical challenges caused by injuries, diseases, or conditions. According to the World Health Organization, over 20% of adults ages 60 and beyond have a mental or neurological disorder. Now, older people experience life stressors that are common to all people, but additionally have to cope with significant ongoing loss in capacities and a decline in functional ability. Older adults may experience mobility, chronic pain, frailty, and other health issues, which could require them to be placed in a nursing home or assisted living. Thus, injured seniors are at high risk, in my opinion, for depression and post-traumatic stress disorder. But what does my opinion matter? I've got the expert on today. That's Dr. Joseph Casciani. He is a PhD and the founder and chief curator of the Living to 100 Club, the new voice for delivering recommendations and inspiration about aging with a positive mindset, no matter how hard the journey. His insights about living longer, healthier, and happier lives reflect his experience with older adults and their families, with paid and unpaid caregivers, writing and public speaking, and the hundreds of mental health professionals and scores of hospitals and long-term care facilities with whom he has worked through the 1980s. So he's been doing this for almost 40 years. After 4 decades of clinical work, Dr. Casciani is now powering a positive attitude about aging through his new book, Living Longer is the New Normal, through membership in his Living to 100 Club and through his live weekly radio show on aging and longevity. Hello, Dr. Casciani, and how are you today, my friend?
Hello, Steve. I'm so happy to be here. I'm doing well, thanks.
Well, you had me on your radio show last week, so I really wanted to get you on the show, so I guess it's worked out for both of us, so it's really good to have you on today.
Yeah, thanks. That was a great episode we had. Yeah.
We sure did. We're going to talk about your show in a little bit. So let me get right into it. Why do some older adults get depressed?
Well, that's a complicated question. From my vantage point, and as you mentioned, I've worked with nursing homes for most of my career and helping patients adjust to their placement and physical decline, and helping them manage any psychological problems. And depression is a common feature we see in nursing home patients because of all of the losses. Some of this is kind of to be expected. I would never say depression is normal, but it is common and very characteristic of this population. There's nothing normal about being depressed. From my vantage point, I tend to be more of a cognitive, cognitive behavior therapist. A lot of depression comes from our attitudes and our self-talk, and how we view what's going on in our lives, how we interpret events. Is an event an unpleasant event, a serious setback, a major loss, and how do we interpret this event? So a lot of it is how do we explain what's happened? Oh, this is just another assault, just like I've had my whole life. I'm just never going to overcome. I'm never going to get out of this. And the person just sinks further into this kind of negative thinking style. The interpretation is like, all right, this is a setback. I can get through this. I'll manage and I'll cope and I'll work to moving forward. So a lot of it is that kind of mental attitude mindset.
So do you agree with the World Health Organization that older adults generally have more life stressors than younger adults, and so they're more prone to having setbacks or depression?
Yeah, for sure. We've always known the statistics, and there's a high incidence of depression. One of the big problems with diagnosing depression in seniors is that it doesn't always fit the neat diagnostic categories that we have for diagnosing other age groups. So there might be depression going on, but it might be manifested as somatic complaints or eating problems or sleeping problems or disinterest. So what I'm saying is probably the incidence of depression is even higher than that 20% that you quoted.
Right. So are you saying that it's not necessarily chemical or something that is like a biological thing, as opposed to, like, is it the setbacks that are causing more depression in older adults, or is it a little of both, or what is your perspective on that?
That's a subject for an extended conversation. I know there is a kind of a certain percentage of people that have a biological or genetic predisposition to depression, and that responds well to medication. Antidepressant medication, psychotropic medication. But largely, from my vantage point as a psychologist, and we don't prescribe meds, although there is a push to get psychologist prescription privileges. But from my vantage point, I would prefer to use psychotherapy to teach a person new skills rather than using medication to treat symptoms. So,
got it.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So, what about the older adults who have experienced a severe health event, such as a catastrophic injury or disease? So, in your 4 decades of practicing geropsychology, did you see a lot of that?
All the time. Yeah,
Okay.
We would see it all the time. Multiple chronic diseases, and accompanying these medical conditions was depression, hopelessness, helplessness, the person feeling as though they can't manage, they can't do anything about it, and they keep kind of getting pulled back into this dark place where they don't see any recovery. I think what happens a lot of times with depression is that all we see is what's wrong. All we see is the disappointments, the losses, the setbacks, and we lose sight of the bigger picture. And I always use the analogy of the way horses are fitted with blinkers sometimes, so they're not distracted by what's going on to their left and right. They can only see straight ahead. So it's as if the depressed person has these filters or blinkers on, and all they see is what's wrong. All they see is what's negative. And if you take the blinkers off, you can say, gee, well, I do have this and I do have that going for me, and I have these people in my, but when they wear in the blinkers, all they see is, I can't walk anymore. I've had a leg amputated, or had a terrible injury, or had a terrible reaction to some medication. That's all they focus on. So that's a big part of the depression, where it really narrows our perspective.
So what are some of the techniques or strategies that you would work when you were working with depressed older adults who just couldn't get over the setback? So how did you go about approaching how to help them overcome this obstacle?
Yeah, a few different ways. One of it is, it's an old saying, is a glass half full or is the glass half empty? I like to use an exercise when I speak with groups. I have the group divided in half, and the left half, I want you to look around the room and find everything that's wrong with it. Torn curtains, spots on the floor, dust and dirt, whatever. And the other half of the room, I want you to look around and find everything that's good about the room. Do that for a couple minutes, and then we reconvene, and I say, okay, left side, you tell me what's wrong. Right side, you tell me what's right. And my point is, they're all looking at the same room. If you're focusing on what's wrong, you're going to find it. If you're focusing on what's right, you're going to find it. And it's a great exercise because, is a glass half full or half empty? It's the same glass, right? There's 4 ounces in an 8-ounce glass. So
Right.
One person sees half empty, but it's the same glass. And that's the point to get across. The person who's depressed, they see everything that's wrong. Let's look at what's right. The other approach I would use often is to observe our self-talk. What do we say to ourselves when something goes wrong? What do we say when we don't hear from our adult children for several days or several weeks? How do we interpret that event? Is it like, oh, they don't love me, they're too busy, I don't mean anything to them? Or, gee, I want to talk to them, I hope they get to me. It's just, how do they interpret, how do they label that event? And that's an important way to move forward, because when we have these setbacks, we have to be ready to kind of accept them, do what we can to fix them, and move on. So a lot of that is, again, that observing what we're saying to ourselves, observing what we're thinking, observing our attitude. The third point is to really stay as physically active as possible. There's a saying, own the first hour of the day, and you own the day. So if you're active and you're busy and you're really determined in that first hour, you own the day. The point is, it's harder to get it going later in the day. But if you start out being active and determined and motivated early on, your day just kind of moves in your favor. And that's a big factor for people who are depressed. It's easy to pull back and, like I said, get sucked into this dark place. It's easy to get pulled back into there, but we really have to be determined and fight and, kind of push to stay out of this dark place. And being physically active is one of the better ways. The other recommendation is to stay connected with family and friends and not retreat, because the more we retreat and pull back and disconnect from others, the more isolated we are, and then we interpret that as, gee, I'm just not so important. I'm not, there's nobody around me that cares, so this contributes to further retreat. So the point is, let's stay active, let's stay connected, let's reach out to people, make those phone calls, stop by your neighbor, do whatever you need to do, and talk to people when you're out rather than retreating. So that, important ways. And, medication is also helpful. We can use medication, as I said. Sometimes it does really do magic when it comes to helping with symptoms. That sad affect, that, kind of feeling of loneliness and sadness. The medication can really help. But I tend to be more of what's called a behavioral activation psychologist, where we really need to work and move and kind of stay with that forward motion, because sitting around and waiting for things to get better usually doesn't work.
That's a really good point, by the way. We're going to be having Colin Hubler on the show in within the next couple of weeks, and he's a physical therapist, and he says that older adults succumb to what's called sitting disease, and they just sit like 5 hours a day watching TV. And that is not good, not only for your physical health, but it can't be good for your mental health. Would you agree?
Yeah, I do, very much so. Yeah, it's so easy. We get into this comfort zone and we get into routines, and it's hard to break out of those comfort zones because they're safe and familiar, and this is what I always do, and I don't want to change it. So, even with the nursing home patients, when I would work with patients and clients, I would always encourage them, to do something. Get out of bed. If you're in bed, you're in your head, and the more you're in your head, you're thinking about everything that's going wrong. So the sitting disease, the staying in bed disease, it's the same thing. We need to push people, and it's called a gentle nudge or a gentle push. If you ask people, do you want to get up? They're going to say no. You say, well, okay, today we're going to get you up, and you start helping them get up. So don't wait for the person who's really, depressed and withdrawn. You kind of have to offer some encouragement, and that gentle push makes a big difference.
Well, yeah, haven't they also shown that when you exercise, your serotonin level goes up, and that just makes you happier? Or dopamine. I'm not a scientist, but I know that when I exercise, I'm a senior, I'm 59 years old. I've been exercising since I was a kid, but I just can't function if I don't exercise. I have to get at least 30 to 45 minutes of exercise a day. One thing I've found also is that it doesn't have to be something that I don't like to do. So if I discovered a mini trampoline, and the mini trampoline is awesome. And I jump on that thing for about 30 minutes a day, and I do a little bit of yoga, and I feel great. So is this something that you try to impart to your patients or to the individuals in the long-term care facilities that you used to care for?
Yeah. The importance of exercise can't be understated. We do get those endorphins after, kind of that, physical exertion, and the long distance runners talk about that. And, staying physically active. And that's, I commend you, Steve, because that's how you need to, build that kind of, not just the physical activity, but you feel that confidence and you feel that energy after. I'm on the treadmill every morning too, and you just know when you miss it, right? You just know when things don't, you just don't feel right if you're missing that exercise activity. So that's a big part of, the whole. Not just overcoming depression, but we now know that living longer includes people who are physically active. If you're familiar with the blue zones and the research that that team did, they went around the world and they looked for areas where people are living the longest, and they found 5 geographic areas where the highest number of centenarians are living. And physical activity is one of the key ingredients for this longevity. And these are people in their 80s, 90s, over 100, still doing gardening, still walking up, 20 or 30 steps to get to the village or their home. And they're just physically active. So there's a lot to be said for helping to overcome those, kind of negative mindsets, as well as really helping us to live longer. It's key. Yeah.
And you said connected with others. It's funny because if my kids don't call me, sometimes I throw myself a pity party. Oh my God, I'm not important to them. And then I think about it. I'm like, how many times did I call my parents when I was in my 20s? So I think that you really bring up a really good point, that you can see the room half full or half empty. And whenever I used to, if I, felt sorry for myself or threw a pity party for myself as a kid, my dad said, let me take you over to shock trauma, and then you really know what it's like to feel sorry for yourself. So there's always someone else that has it worse than you. And so, right?
Yeah, that's a good point. It's all relative. it's all relative, because as bad as we feel, there are people who are worse. And as good as we are, there are people who are doing better than we are. You're right. So we can't compare. That's a trap when we start comparing ourselves to others, right? Yeah, that's a
right.
trap. There's no way out of that.
Yeah. So tell me why you started the Living to 100 Club and what it's about.
Sure. I learned a lot over the years, and a lot about what it takes to get people thinking positively about aging, because there is, still this negative stereotype about growing old and what it means. It means decline and loss and, physical changes in our body, our senses, our, eyesight, hearing. And I wanted to, and there is a very strong movement out there, fortunately, about looking at aging and as something to celebrate. And that's important. And so we see a lot of information, a lot of articles, a lot of books, a lot of internet information about successful aging. But one extra piece that I wanted to add was, look, successful aging means moving forward no matter what happens. We're not all going to be running marathons in our 70s and 80s. There are people who have their legs amputated because of diabetes. And does that mean they're not going to age successfully? I don't think so. To me, successful aging means facing those events and dealing with them, managing them, and moving on. So my Living to 100 Club is all about successful aging, but it's not just the people who don't have any problems. It's about people who have these problems and, in spite of the problems, move on. So, the other point I like to emphasize is that we all have this, what I call this reservoir of strength and determination to make it over the setbacks. And probably people, your clients that, you've worked with and have had injuries and major losses, there is that kind of fire inside that never goes out, and I would always try to help people find that, whatever it is, a spark, or some people call it resilience or grit, or there's always that inside. And I want to make that point in my club, and I want to make sure people are, can get in touch with that internal reservoir of strength, because it's always there and it never goes away. So Living to 100 Club is about successful aging, making it over the hurdles, and staying inspired about what our senior years can bring to us. So I'm doing a weekly radio show, as you mentioned. You were a guest last week. I have this book, Living Longer is the New Normal. I have a handbook called 9 Tips to Creating a Positive Frame of Mind as We Age. If your listeners want to go to my website, www.livingto100.club, not .com or .org, it's .club/9 tips, you can download a copy. A lot of what I'm discussing today about my approaches on staying positive and having this positive frame of mind as we age. So visitors can do that. And I also do some phone consults. If anybody wants to, give me a call, there's a 30-minute phone consultation, and people can get that information on my website, on the club store. And, doing a lot of blogs and writing articles and commenting, and it's fun for me. I've spent 30 plus years working in nursing homes, and that's rewarding work, but it's also heavy duty, and I'm looking to kind of shift into this new world, new chapter, and
you're following your own advice, right?
That's right.
It's a new chapter, and you're staying positive. Yeah. Let me ask you this. So you obviously just came out with this new book. Could you give our listeners from the injured senior community, give them maybe a couple of tips that they could take away from this episode as far as how that they can lessen or their depression, or kind of see things from the glass half filled? What are some takeaways that they can take to start living a better, more mentally healthier life?
Well, a big one is the amount of worrying that we do. We have to be careful about worrying about things that we cannot control, right? People worry about the weather, they worry about the stock market, they worry about things that are out of our control. And that's a real heavy duty kind of baggage to carry around. So one tip is be careful about worrying over things that we have no control over. Yeah, we do have control over our thoughts, our feelings, our values, our principles, our opinions, but we don't have control over, things like traffic and, anything else going on in the world that we're worried about, and it doesn't get us anywhere. So be careful. Another point to keep in mind is, I like to say we're not defined by who we were yesterday, right? If we have an accident and we're different, something happened to us physically, maybe we can't walk anymore, maybe we lost use of our left arm, that doesn't define who we are today, right? What happened?
Well, I totally agree. I mean, nothing. You never guaranteed what's going to happen tomorrow. Things are gonna happen.
Yeah. So the way we define ourselves today is not limited to what we were yesterday. And if we have a history of successes, it doesn't mean it's going to happen. If we have a history of failures, it doesn't mean it's going to happen. So we have to remember that whole piece about redefining ourselves. That's always happened. It's always happening. Again, I talk about that self-image, and I don't know if we have time for this quick story about Steve Jobs.
Sure.
But Steve Jobs was adopted as an infant, and he found out about that when he was, I think, a preteen, and he felt devastated. Gee, my own biological mother didn't want me. I must be worthless. I must be, just a terrible person. My own parents didn't want me around, so I must have no value. And the adopted parents said, "Look, Steve, when we saw you in the hospital, we wanted to adopt you because you were the most beautiful child, the most beautiful infant, and we thought you would be the most important. Not important, they didn't say that, but we thought you were just the most important person to us." So it was like a flip of a switch, Steve. He went from being worthless to the most important person to his parents. And what happened? You're right. They didn't give him anything new. They didn't give him any new talents or skills. It was like a light switch that got thrown. Gee, I'm not who I was, who I thought I was. I'm really this instead. And that's what we can all do. We can all have that same kind of mental clarity and give up some of those old, kind of constrictions and really see ourselves in a more objective way. And that's so important, how we define ourselves. And I would always say, just because you have physical loss. Maybe you can't speak so well anymore, or, you can't walk, you're in a wheelchair, or maybe you have had that amputation. We are not our bodies, right? The body is there.
Bodies are, right. Bodies don't stay the same. You don't stay like Charles Atlas your whole life.
They don't stay the same.
Right.
No, and just because part of it is gone, it doesn't mean part of me is gone. There's always the me in there. There's always, the bodies don't cooperate, but there's always the me in there that, takes us forward. And the bodies may help, the bodies may not help, but there's always that kind of that inner determination that takes us forward.
Yeah. I really like that. And thank God that Steve Jobs, that his parents loved him and created this new mindset, or I wouldn't be talking on my Apple cell phone right now. I'd be using the rotary phone. So
that's right.
So Steve Jobs, that was vital.
Yeah. And think of all the people that, have those negative self-images based on, what they heard or what they were told and how, constrained they are. Yeah.
Absolutely. And there's no reason that you can't start a new chapter in your life at any age. So, Dr. Casciani, I want to thank you for helping us out today and helping my injured senior community learn about how to fight depression and for just fighting depression in the aging population as well. I can't believe we're out of time. It's really just went by really, really fast. Okay, again, your Living to 100 Club. If someone wants to join, do they just go to your website again, or how can they get there?
Yeah, right now you'll see drop downs for signing up for our newsletter, and that's the status of our membership. At some point, we're going to be kind of refining that a little bit, but right now it's just signing up for our newsletter. You get my blog, you get the announcements of our radio show. So just go to the website, livingto100.club, and click on member and enter your name for, get on our email list. Yeah,
Great.
And we'll be.
I'm on the list, by the way, so I get all your stuff, and it's awesome. It's awesome. The radio show is on Voice America, correct?
Correct. Every Friday, 2 p.m. Pacific time. And there's downloads. If you don't make it live, there's always a download. So when people get the announcement, they get a link to the show, but they also get a link to listening to all of our any of our past recordings.
So you have a library, so there's lots of past episodes that people can go to. Exactly. Okay,
over
great.
50 shows
great.
now. Yeah.
That's
Steve,
awesome.
I want to thank you for inviting me. I enjoyed this. I always get to share my insights and my kind of recommendations, suggestions. So I'm glad to have this opportunity. I thank you for that. Yeah.
You are very welcome. We'll have to have you back soon. Thanks again, Dr. Casciani. You are very welcome. We can't wait to have you back. Injured Senior Community, if you'd like to connect with me about an injury you sustained due to someone else's negligence, please email me at steve@injuredseniorhotline.com or call 877-228-4878 or HURT. Feel free to email or call me about any topics you'd like to see us cover on future shows. If you'd like to audition to be a guest on the Injured Senior podcast, such as telling your story as an injured senior or elder, or as the child or loved one of an injured senior or elder, email me, please. Senior community, if you like the content we discussed today in this episode, please head on over to the show notes where you will find a summary of today's show and any important links we mention in this episode. Feel free to reach out to me at any time to talk about anything that's on your mind. Consider subscribing to this podcast on your favorite platform. And when you do subscribe, feel free to rate and review. We could always use some positive reviews, and we appreciate if you feel that way. Thanks again for listening to today's show. Be sure to tune in to next week's show. I will talk to you next week. Goodbye, everybody.
Thanks for listening to the Injured Senior Podcast with Steve H. Heisler. If you enjoyed the podcast, please rate, subscribe, review, and share on Apple, Google, or wherever you get your podcasts. To find out more or to get help anytime, go to injuredseniorhotline.com or call 855-622-6530. We'll see you next time.